There's a conversation happening in Washington right now, one that directly affects millions of Americans living on fixed incomes, and if you're a Social Security recipient, an SSI or SSDI beneficiary, or a veteran receiving monthly benefits, you need to understand what's actually being discussed and what isn't. Because here's the thing, the phrase extra $200 a month has been circulating online. You may have seen it on social media. You may have heard it from a neighbor or a family member. And before you make any plans based on that number, before you get your hopes up or get frustrated, it's worth sitting down and walking through exactly what is actually on the table. So let's do that together, calmly, clearly, and honestly. As of today, nothing has been approved by Congress. There is no confirmed check. There is no signed legislation. What does exist is a series of ongoing discussions, advocacy proposals, and legislative debates around the idea of providing temporary inflation relief to Americans on fixed incomes. That distinction matters a lot, but it also doesn't mean the conversation isn't real, because it is. And for millions of retirees and seniors who are quietly struggling to keep up with rising prices, the fact that this is even being discussed says something important about where the country's financial pressure points are right now. In this video, we're going to break down exactly what this proposal involves, who it could affect, why it keeps resurfacing, what obstacles stand in the way, and most importantly, how realistic it is that something like this ever becomes law. Let's start at the beginning. If you've been watching your grocery receipts grow over the past few years, you already know why this conversation keeps coming up. Inflation has had a very specific and painful effect on people living on fixed incomes. Unlike someone still working who might receive a raise, a promotion, or new job opportunities to help absorb higher prices, retirees and Social Security recipients are working with a more or less defined amount every month. When the cost of a gallon of milk goes up, when utility rates climb, when Medicare premiums increase, that comes directly out of the same pool of money. And while Social Security does include a cost of living adjustment, what most people know as the COLA, many retirees and financial advocates have argued for years that these adjustments don't fully reflect the kind of spending patterns that older Americans actually have. Think about it this way. The standard inflation measurement used to calculate COLA increases tracks the spending habits of urban workers. But seniors tend to spend a higher proportion of their income on healthcare, housing, and prescription drugs, all categories that have seen some of the sharpest price increases in recent years. You may have experienced this yourself. Your COLA adjustment comes through in January, and yet somehow it feels like you're still falling a little further behind. That frustration is not imagined, it's documented. And it's one of the core reasons why lawmakers, advocacy groups, and senior-focused policy organizations continue to bring up the need for additional relief measures. Now, some of these conversations are broad. They're about restructuring how COLA is calculated over the long term. Others are more immediate and targeted, temporary emergency relief payments, designed to help fixed-income Americans absorb the financial stress of a high-inflation environment. The $200 monthly figure that's been circulating falls into that second category. It's connected to the idea of a temporary, supplemental relief payment on top of existing benefits, but what exactly has been proposed, and where does that idea come from? That's what we need to look at next, because there's more nuance here than most headlines suggest. Let's be very clear about this from the start. There is no approved, confirmed, or signed program that adds $200 per month to Social Security, SSI SSDI, or veterans benefits. Anyone telling you otherwise is not giving you accurate information. What does exist is a broader policy conversation that has included proposals, some introduced in Congress, some advocated by outside organizations, around providing a form of emergency inflation relief to fixed-income Americans. The $200 figure has been mentioned in the context of what such a relief payment might look like if it were structured as a monthly supplement. The idea is conceptually similar to how COVID-era relief payments worked, targeting a specific, vulnerable population and providing temporary financial assistance to help offset an economic disruption. In this case, that disruption is sustained inflation. Some proposals have been more formal, introduced as legislation and referred to congressional committees. Others exist more as advocacy positions, things that senior-focused organizations are publicly pushing for, hoping to apply political pressure. And some of what you're seeing online blends these two categories together in ways that can feel more concrete than they actually are. It's also worth noting that the groups most frequently mentioned in connection with these discussions include Social Security retirement beneficiaries, Supplemental Security Income recipients, SSI Social Security Disability Insurance recipients, SSDI, and in some versions, certain veterans receiving monthly benefits. The reasoning behind including all of these groups is straightforward. They share a common financial profile. They rely on fixed monthly income. They have limited ability to absorb sudden cost increases. And they represent some of the most economically vulnerable Americans in the country. If a proposal like this ever moved forward and became law, Eligibility details would depend entirely on the specific language of the legislation. That's not a vague statement, it's a genuinely important point. The details of income thresholds, benefit types, and payment structures would all be defined in the bill itself. What we can say right now is that these groups are most commonly referenced in the discussions. But here's the part many people don't think about, and it's actually the most politically complicated piece of the whole puzzle. Where would the money come from? And who in Congress would support paying for it? That question, more than anything else, is what determines whether a proposal like this ever gets off the ground. Before we get into the obstacles, it's worth spending a moment on the human side of this conversation, because that's where the real weight of the issue lives. For someone receiving $1,400 or $1,600 a month in Social Security benefits, an extra $200 isn't abstract. That's a week's worth of groceries. That's a utility bill. That's a copay or two. That's the difference between refilling a prescription on time and waiting until next month. When you think about it that way, it becomes easier to understand why this conversation generates so much attention. It's not about politics for most people. It's about whether you can get to the end of the month without making painful choices. Seniors across the country have been making those choices more often, skipping doses to stretch medications, cutting back on fresh food because processed food is cheaper, letting the heat run lower in winter than is comfortable. These aren't dramatic headline-worthy stories. They're quiet daily adjustments made by millions of people who are simply trying to manage. Advocates for senior relief argue that the existing COLA mechanism, while valuable, wasn't designed to absorb the kind of sustained, multi-year inflation pressure that we've seen recently. A one-time or temporary supplemental payment, they say, could function as a bridge, a way to help people stay afloat while longer-term structural questions about Social Security's funding are being worked out. There's also an equity argument that comes up in these discussions. Younger Americans who experienced financial hardship during high inflation periods had more tools available to them. The ability to job hop for higher wages, to take on additional work, to make lifestyle changes that generate income. Retirees on fixed incomes don't have most of those options. In that sense, advocates argue they deserve a targeted response. Now, supporters of the relief idea acknowledge that a temporary payment isn't a permanent solution. It doesn't fix the underlying questions about Social Security's long-term solvency. It doesn't address the structural gap between how COLA is calculated and what seniors actually spend money on. But they argue that waiting for a perfect solution while people are struggling right now isn't a responsible answer either. That argument has real appeal, but it runs directly into a wall of political and budgetary complexity. And that's what we need to talk about next. This is where the script has to shift a little, because if we're going to be genuinely useful to you, we can't just talk about the proposal. We have to talk about why it's so hard to actually pass something like this. The federal budget is, to put it simply, already stretched. There are active debates in Congress about spending levels, deficit reduction, and the long-term fiscal path of the country. Adding a new recurring benefit payment for tens of millions of Americans would cost a significant amount of money, and that question of how do we pay for it is where many proposals run into serious trouble. There are essentially two camps in these budget conversations. One camp argues that the country has a responsibility to protect its most vulnerable citizens from economic hardship, and that the cost of a temporary relief program is manageable and justified. The other camp argues that adding to federal spending, especially recurring or semi-recurring benefit payments, risks increasing the national deficit and could contribute to the very inflation it's trying to address. Both of these positions have supporters across the political spectrum, though they tend to cluster differently by party. And that's where bipartisan negotiation becomes critical and difficult. For a proposal like this to actually become law, it would need to move through a very specific legislative process. It would need to be introduced as a bill, referred to the appropriate committee, likely the Senate Finance Committee or the House Ways and Means Committee, pass committee review, be scheduled for a floor vote in both chambers, pass both the Senate and the House with sufficient votes, and then be signed by the president. That's a long road. And historically, the vast majority of bills introduced in Congress never complete that journey. Many are introduced as messaging, a way for a lawmaker to go on record supporting a popular idea, even if they know the bill has little chance of advancing. Others are introduced in good faith, but die in committee because they can't build the coalition needed to move forward. It's also worth noting that timing matters enormously in Congress. Election years tend to produce more proposals related to popular issues, and senior benefits are genuinely popular. But election year momentum doesn't always translate into actual legislation, especially when the budget math is complicated. None of this means the conversation isn't worth having or that progress is impossible. It means the path from proposal to law is genuinely difficult, and anyone who tells you this is already done or already approved simply isn't telling you the truth. What are the realistic chances, then, that seniors actually see something like this? Let's talk about that honestly. This is the part of the conversation that requires the most honesty and the most nuance. Right now, there is no specific named bill with broad congressional support that would add $200 per month to Social Security or related benefits. That's just the reality. The discussions exist. The advocacy exists. Some bill introductions exist. But none of that has crystallized into legislation with a clear path to passage. The likelihood of something like this advancing depends on several converging factors. The first is inflation itself. If inflation remains elevated or increases, the political pressure to address it for fixed-income Americans grows. If inflation continues to ease, that pressure diminishes. Economic conditions are, in some ways, the most powerful driver of this kind of legislation. The second is budget negotiation dynamics. Federal spending conversations happen in cycles, and they're often tied to larger budget agreements, debt ceiling negotiations, and appropriations debates. Sometimes a measure that seems politically difficult in isolation becomes viable when it's attached to a broader package. That's not guaranteed, but it's a real part of how Congress works. The third is electoral pressure. The senior voting bloc is one of the most consistent and powerful in American elections. Lawmakers on both sides are aware of that. Proposals that directly benefit seniors tend to get attention during campaign seasons, whether or not they ultimately become law. And the fourth is advocacy momentum. Organizations that represent seniors, groups focused on Social Security, retirement security, and healthcare affordability, continue to push publicly for stronger relief measures. Their influence on congressional priorities is real, even if it's gradual. Taken together, these factors suggest that while nothing is guaranteed, and while the current proposal as described hasn't been approved, this conversation is not going away. The conditions that generate it aren't going away. The financial pressure seniors face isn't going away. What that means practically is this. It's possible that some form of relief legislation, whether it looks exactly like what's being described or takes a different shape, could advance in the coming years. It's also possible that it doesn't. Honest analysis requires holding both of those possibilities at the same time. For now, the most responsible framing is this. This is a discussion, not a done deal. Seniors should be informed but should not make financial decisions based on money that has not been approved. So if you're watching this as someone who is affected by these conversations, as a retiree, as a Social Security recipient, as someone on a fixed income, what should you actually do with this information? The most important thing is to stay informed through reliable sources. If any legislation related to Social Security benefits, SSI, SSDI, or veterans benefits is officially passed and signed into law, the announcement will come from the Social Security Administration directly. You can visit ssa.gov for official updates. You can also check the official websites of your congressional representatives to see what legislation they've introduced or supported. The second thing is to be cautious about what you see on social media. There's a real and persistent problem with viral posts that claim checks have already been approved, that payments are already in the mail, or that a new program is already active. These posts often look credible, sometimes use official-sounding language, and spread quickly because people want them to be true. If you see something like that, look for the original source before you believe it or share it. If you can't find a confirmation on ssa.gov or in a credible news outlet, treat it with skepticism. The third thing is to understand that staying engaged with this topic, following the policy debates, understanding the proposals, is actually meaningful. Public awareness of these issues does influence lawmakers. When people understand what's being discussed and make their voices heard through letters, calls to their representatives, or participation in advocacy organizations, it contributes to the political environment in which these decisions are made. That's not a passive role. That's civic participation. And if you want to share your experience, if rising costs have genuinely affected your monthly budget, if you've had to make difficult choices this year, there's real value in making that visible. Lawmakers respond to the testimony of real constituents. Your story matters in these discussions. Let's bring this all together. What we know is this. There is a genuine, ongoing conversation in Washington and in the advocacy community about providing some form of inflation relief to seniors and fixed-income Americans. The number $200 per month has been part of that conversation. The groups most often mentioned, Social Security retirees, SSI recipients, SSDI recipients, and certain veterans are among the most economically vulnerable Americans, and the case for helping them is real and compelling. What we also know is this. As of today, nothing has been approved. No bill has passed. No payments have been authorized. The road from proposal to law is long and complicated, and it requires navigating budget debates, bipartisan negotiations, and competing political priorities. The honest truth is that this conversation reflects something real about where millions of Americans are right now. The financial pressure is real. The gap between fixed incomes and rising costs is real. The frustration is real. None of that disappears whether or not this specific proposal ever advances. For now, the best thing anyone can do is stay informed, stay grounded, and separate what has actually been approved from what is still being discussed. Those are two very different things, and understanding the difference is exactly the kind of clarity that helps people make better decisions. That's what gray policy is here for. Not to hype, not to alarm, not to promise things that haven't happened, but to give you the clearest, most honest picture of what is actually going on with the policies that affect your life. If that kind of straightforward, calm coverage is useful to you, we'd be glad to have you here. There are more policy discussions ahead: Social Security updates, Medicare developments, benefit changes, and legislative debates that matter to retirees and fixed-income Americans. We'll cover all of it the same way we've covered this one. Carefully, clearly, and without the noise. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next one.